A tranquil seaside village, the beginning of an end, and a killer hiding in plain sight. This is not just a tale of murder, it's a psychological game, where losing comes at the cost of life. The village seemed untouched by time, its cobbled streets bathed in the soft glow of a late afternoon sun. The gentle breeze carried the scent of salt and blooming jasmine, a tranquil lull that embraced the seaside haven. From the distance, the waves lapped against the shore in a rhythmic harmony, like the world itself had slowed to a serene crawl. But even in this idyllic place, there was an undercurrent of something darker, something unseen, like the quiet before a storm. At the heart of this picturesque village stood a lavish farmhouse, its ivy-clad stone walls in odd contrast to the bright sky above. As Mr. Treves drove up the long winding lane that led to the house, he noticed how the landscape seemed to fade away, as if the village itself wanted to keep its secrets hidden from the world. His car crunched to a stop in the gravel driveway, and as he stepped out, he adjusted his well-tailored coat and surveyed the gathering. The mansion stood, silent and imposing, waiting for the weekend's guests to make their entrance. Mr. Treves was not just any guest, though. He was a renowned criminologist, a man whose mind worked in the shadows, where others feared to tread. His sharp gaze absorbed every detail of the place, as if it were a crime scene. His reputation was built not on solving mysteries, but on understanding the minds of those who created them. The moment he stepped through the grand entrance, a hush fell over the room. His presence alone was enough to make the chatter falter. He wasn't the sort to blend in. He was the kind of man who made people uneasy, yet they couldn't look away. As the guests filtered in, each one more polished than the last, Mr. Treves caught sight of a figure standing in the corner of the room still, motionless, like an outsider watching from the edge. His brow furrowed for a moment, but he said nothing. Instead, he gave a slight smile and turned toward the others, allowing the sense of unease to build quietly, like the first rumbles of thunder before a storm. The conversation resumed, but there was something off about the way the guests exchanged pleasantries. An air of uncertainty hung between them, like an invisible thread that connected their smiles and their shadows. The conversations were polite, but every word seemed weighted, every glance too careful. They were all strangers, yet there was a sense that they knew something, perhaps feared something that none of them dared to speak of. And then, as the clock struck the hour, Mr. Treves made his entrance into the gathering like a predator to a feast. He moved into the center of the room with effortless grace, his eyes scanning the room, studying each face with a clinical precision. He was a man used to solving puzzles, but this wasn't just any puzzle. This was a game of the Minda game he had been invited to play, but one that was already in motion long before his arrival. With an almost casual tone, Mr. Treves dropped a bombshell that froze the room in place. "Detective stories begin at the wrong point," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Murder is the end, not the beginning. The story always starts long before that." The words landed like a sharp, unexpected twist, sending an unspoken shiver through the group. For a moment, no one dared respond. It was as if the air itself had become heavy, laden with the weight of unspoken truths. But the true tension hadn't yet begun to unravel. As Mr. Treves spoke, his gaze flicked briefly to the far corner of the room where that still figure had been standing. And in that fleeting moment, the guest's eyes met his with a cold, unsettling certainty, before they quickly turned away. It was only a brief glance, but it was enough to make the hairs on the back of Mr. Treves' neck stand up. The figure, once a passive observer, was now something more. A part of the scene, but not quite a part of the group, watching, waiting. As the last words left Mr. Treves' lips, the mysterious figure disappeared into the shadows of the house. And for the first time that evening, a chill swept through the room, a chilling reminder that in this gathering of strangers, something far darker than murder was at play. Something sinister had already begun. The guests, unaware of the predator lurking in their midst, returned to their casual conversations, but the unease lingered. One by one, their faces turned toward the windows, as if they could sense that the peaceful village outside wasn't as tranquil as it seemed. Cliffhanger ending. Outside, the sky had darkened, and the breeze that once seemed gentle now carried an edge, a whisper of things to come. But it wasn't until the figure disappeared entirely, slipping silently through the house, that the first true seed of doubt was planted. As the night deepened and the guests unknowingly drew closer to the inevitable conclusion, one question lingered in the air. Who was watching them? The gathering of characters. As the golden sun began to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows over the elegant farmhouse, the first few guests arrived. The air felt thick with expectation, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Mr. Trevis, renowned criminologist and an enigma in his own right, was the first to step through the grand front door. Tall, with a sharp, calculating gaze, he surveyed the room like a hunter, his mind always one step ahead. There was a cool confidence to him, but a darkness too, as though his obsession with the criminal mind had seeped into his very soul. His comment upon entry was chilling, almost too casually delivered. Detective stories begin at the wrong point. Murder is the end, not the beginning. The story always starts long before that. His voice lingered in the air, the weight of it settling over the group like a shroud. The others shuffled into the parlor, trying to ignore the unease his words had sown. Eleanor Green was next. A widow, but not a simple one. She was beautiful, but it was a kind of beauty that had been weathered by grief and loss. Her eyes were always darting, as if scanning for threats, and her smile seemed more like a mask she wore to hide the darkness inside. She'd lost her husband years ago, but the secrets she carried seemed to have only grown heavier with time. Rumors swirled in the small town about her mysterious past, whispers about connections she wished to forget. David Hale entered shortly after, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he reached for his glass of wine. An artist, but one whose paintings were as troubled as the man himself. His eyes, once full of ambition, now carried the weight of regret. It wasn't just his financial struggles that haunted him. There were darker demons in his past, shadows that he kept locked away in the corners of his mind. Those who knew him wondered if he was running from something, or someone. Then there was Lucy Parker, the charming and inquisitive travel journalist who had a knack for uncovering secrets. Always the life of the party, her bright eyes sparkled with curiosity. But it was the sharpness behind her smile that unsettled those who observed her too closely. She was a master of reading people, of unraveling their stories, but the question remained, what story was she hiding? Finally, Nicholas Trent walked in, his polished exterior almost too perfect. He was the kind of man whose charm could convince anyone of anything. Yet there was something about him that felt off. He moved with a smooth confidence that bordered on arrogance, and there was no shortage of rumors about his shady business dealings. Yet he wore his wealth like a crown, and his charm acted as a veil for the dangerous world he inhabited. As the night unfolded, the group gathered in the elegant dining room, each person sizing the other up in silence. Tension simmered beneath the surface, yet no one spoke of it aloud. But then, in the midst of this uneasy silence, Mr. Treves casually began to profile them. One by one, he picked apart their personalities with unnerving precision. "Eleanor," he began, his eyes locking onto hers, "you carry secrets, but they're not the ones most people think." Eleanor stiffened, her hand tightening around her wineglass. "David," he continued, a cold smile tugging at his lips, "you've painted more than just canvases, haven't you? The things you've painted in your mind are harder to escape than any brushstroke." David's face tightened, and his eyes flickered to the side, avoiding Trevor's piercing gaze. "Lucy," he said, his tone shifting, "you've traveled far, but there's one place you've never dared to visit: the truth behind your own motivations." Lucy's smile faltered, just for a moment, but long enough to be noticed. "And you, Nicholas," Treves said, his voice lowering, "you're a businessman, but not in the way you want everyone to think. The things you've done to secure your wealth have left a trail that can be followed, if one knows where to look." The room fell deathly quiet. The guests exchanged glances, their minds racing. How could he know these things? Was he simply guessing? Or had he been watching them long before this weekend? Suddenly, Eleanor's face drained of color as she quickly slipped a letter into her pocket, her hand trembling as if she'd just been caught doing something unspeakable. but no one said anything. The air felt heavier now, charged with suspicion and uncertainty. The atmosphere shifted, like the calm before a storm. Then, from the shadows of the hallway, a figure stood unseen by the others, yet very much present. The mysterious watcher had returned. Cliffhanger ending. As the guests continued their uneasy conversation, no one noticed the figure until a faint sound broke the stillness, a door creaking open, followed by the faintest of footsteps. All eyes turned towards the source of the sound, but when they looked, no one was there. Only the lingering echo of the steps remained. Who was watching them, and why? But then, just as the dinner began to wind down, the lights flickered. A brief, unsettling moment of darkness. And when they returned, the room felt different, charged, as though the very air had shifted. Cliffhanger ending. The clock on the wall chimed sharply, echoing through the room. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but it was Eleanor who looked most affected. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Before anyone could ask, she rushed out of the room, her face pale and drawn, the letter still burning a hole in her pocket. The others followed her with their eyes, their curiosity piqued, but none dared to speak. And then, the silence was broken by a loud crash, something heavy falling to the floor upstairs, followed by a scream that sent shivers down their spines. What had happened to Eleanor? Was it a cry for help or something much darker? Rising tension. The air in the dining room grew colder, heavier with each passing minute. Mr. Treves, always the enigmatic figure at the center of it all, was unusually quiet. He sat back in his chair, his eyes darting between the guests, reading them as though they were open books. The rest of the group tried to push past the unease, engaging in fragmented conversations, but the tension was palpable. Every word, every glance felt charged. Then, out of nowhere, Mr. Treves broke the silence with a statement that made the room seem even colder. His voice was soft, yet his words sliced through the air like a blade. "I feel this weekend will be someone's end," he said, looking directly at Eleanor. The room went still. Eleanor, who had been nervously fidgeting with her silverware, froze. Her eyes flickered to Mr. Treves for a moment, a flicker of something passing across her face. Fear. Regret? But it was gone before anyone could fully catch it. Lucy shifted in her seat, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. It felt as if the very walls of the house were closing in on them, as if Mr. Treves knew something none of them did. His gaze lingered on Eleanor for a second too long, and she hastily looked away, swallowing hard. David's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, the unease in his voice betraying his bravado. But Mr. Treves only smiled, the expression unreadable. Before he could respond, Eleanor suddenly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. I need some air," she muttered, her voice shaking. She didn't wait for anyone to reply as she hurried out of the room. Lucy exchanged a glance with David, both of them feeling the same unease creeping into their veins. What had just happened? What was going on with Eleanor? Moments later, just as the group tried to shake off the odd tension, a scream cut through the air, shattering the fragile calm. It came from outside, high-pitched and frantic, echoing from the direction of the cliffs. The sound was unmistakable, a cry for help. A desperate, gut-wrenching scream that sent icy chills down their spines. "Eleanor!" Lucy shouted, standing up abruptly. Her heart pounded in her chest as she rushed to the door, followed by the rest of the group. The sound of their footsteps was drowned by the pounding of their own hearts. Something had happened, something terrible. They ran through the darkened hallway and out into the cold, windy night, the chill of the ocean air biting at their skin. The cliffs loomed ahead, the sea crashing violently below, illuminated only by the pale moonlight. The distant scream echoed in their ears, fading but still hauntingly present. As they reached the edge of the cliff, their eyes scanned the jagged rocks and the dark expanse of the sea below. There was no sign of Eleanor, only the eerie, wind-swept silence. But then, a flash of red caught Lucy's eye. She moved toward it, her breath hitching in her throat. There, half buried in the grass near the edge of the cliff, was a blood-stained scarf. The rich, deep red stood out starkly against the darkness of the night. The fabric twisted in an unsettling way, as though someone had torn it in haste. The scarf was torn at the edges, stained with something dark, something that didn't look like just fabric dye. Lucy's heart skipped a beat as she reached out to touch it. The scarf was cold to the touch, but it was unmistakably Eleanor's. A chill settled in her bones. Where was Eleanor? Was she? What's going on here? David's voice broke through her thoughts. He stood beside her, eyes wide with disbelief. Is she dead? Did she fall? His words were shaky, but there was something else in his eyes, something more than concern. Something he wasn't saying. No, Lucy replied, her voice trembling. She couldn't have. They all gathered around the scarf, their faces pale in the moonlight. Mr. Treves stepped forward, his gaze lingering on the bloody stain. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes. There was something in them, something too knowing. This doesn't look like an accident, Nicholas murmured, his voice low and tight with tension. His usually confident demeanor was gone, replaced by an air of discomfort, as though he knew exactly how dangerous this situation could be. His eyes flickered nervously to David. Mr. Treves, however, remained calm. Too calm. He crouched beside the scarf, his gloved hands brushing against the fabric, as if examining it for something only he could see. It's a message, he said, his voice dark and certain. A message, but from who? His gaze flicked up to meet the others, his eyes full of unspoken truths. Eleanor might be gone, or worse, she might be playing a very dangerous game. The words hung in the air, thick with tension. The group was frozen in place, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Was Eleanor dead? Had she fallen to her death from the cliffs, or had something more sinister happened? And where was she now? Was this all some kind of twisted game, or was something far darker unfolding around them? The questions pounded in Lucy's mind as she took a step back from the group, her breath coming out in short, jagged bursts. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something, that this wasn't just a random disappearance. There was a pattern here. Someone had planned this. And worse still, they might be watching them, waiting for their next move. Cliffhanger ending. Suddenly, a figure appeared from the shadows, just beyond the edge of the cliffs. A shape tall and thin, standing against the dark expanse of the ocean. For a split second, Lucy thought it was Eleanor, but as the figure stepped forward into the moonlight, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Eleanor. It was someone else, someone they didn't recognize, and they were holding something in their hand. A knife. The investigation begins. The morning after the terrifying discovery at the cliffs was a strange one, silent, heavy with the weight of fear and uncertainty. The farmhouse that had once felt like an idyllic retreat now seemed oppressive, its walls closing in on the group. The air was thick with suspicion, everyone quietly questioning the events of the night. Where was Eleanor? Had she fallen, or had something far more sinister occurred? The unanswered questions swirled in the heavy silence, eating away at their minds. Mr. Treves, despite the storm of uncertainty, maintained his calm. He had stepped into the role of leader without hesitation. No one questioned his authority. The renowned criminologist's piercing eyes swept over the group, silently evaluating each person. His mind raced, calculating, assessing, uncovering the pieces of the puzzle they were too afraid to put together. "We need to talk," Mr. Treves said, his voice low but firm. "Now." He led the guests into the drawing room. The sun was barely breaking through the clouds, casting faint rays through the thick curtains, but the mood was anything but warm. One by one, the guests sat down, each of them avoiding each other's gaze, their minds racing with the implications of what had happened. Mr. Treves stood before them, an unyielding presence in the room. The tension was suffocating. "Someone here knows what happened to Eleanor," he began, his voice cold and commanding. "And I intend to find out who." His gaze lingered on David, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. David was already sweating, beads of perspiration dotting his forehead despite the coolness of the room. His usually confident posture was gone, replaced by an almost nervous twitch in his fingers, as he drummed them on the armrest. Mr. Treves didn't need to ask, already knew. David had something to hide. "What's your financial situation, Mr. Hale?" Mr. Treves' voice was smooth, but his words were sharp as daggers. David's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, but there was none. The truth was closing in on him. David let out a shaky breath, his lips trembling. I've been struggling, all right. The artist business, it's not what it used to be. I owe money to some people. People I can't afford to disappoint." His voice faltered as he spoke, and he avoided eye contact with the others. The unspoken implication was clear. Debt, desperation, maybe enough to do anything. Mr. Treves nodded slowly, never breaking his stare. "Desperate people do desperate things, don't they?" David's face flushed with shame and fear. "I didn't hurt anyone, if that's what you're thinking. I didn't." "Then what were you arguing about last night?" Lucy interjected, her voice cutting through the tension. She wasn't sure why she said it, but the words had been lingering on her mind ever since she overheard their argument near the barn. David's and Nicholas's hushed voices had carried on the wind, but she had caught enough to know it wasn't about something as simple as art. David's eyes widened in panic. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Mr. Treves's piercing gaze moved between the two men, unblinking. Nicholas shifted uncomfortably, his usually cool demeanor cracking just a fraction. He avoided looking at David, his hands folding into tight fists on the armrest. "I know about the blackmail, Trent." Mr. Treves' voice dropped to a near whisper, but it was loaded with menace. The words hit like a slap. Nicholas's eyes snapped up to meet Treves's, his posture stiffening. A bead of sweat slid down his temple, his jaw tightening. "Blackmail? What are you talking about?" Nicholas's voice was sharp, but there was no mistaking the strain behind his words. Mr. Treves's eyes narrowed. "I have eyes everywhere, Trent. You thought you could hide it. A business deal gone bad. People always think they can keep their secrets buried, but the truth has a way of finding the light." The room held its breath. The air grew heavier, more oppressive, as the others looked at Nicholas, with a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. What kind of man had they been sharing this weekend with? Was he really the charming, suave businessman he'd appeared to be? Or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface? Lucy watched them all, feeling the pulse of panic begin to stir in her own chest. But it wasn't Nicholas or David who weighed on her mind. It was Eleanor. And the fact that there was one person in this room who knew far more than they were letting on. And that person was her. Mr. Treves turned to Lucy with a sharp, assessing look. Her heart skipped a beat as his eyes bore into hers. She could feel the weight of the room suddenly shift. Every eye in the room was on her now, waiting for her to speak, but she couldn't find the words. Not with everything that had happened. Not with everything that she had kept buried for so long. "You've been holding something back, haven't you, Miss Parker?" Mr. Treves's voice was calm, almost too calm. "What's your connection to Eleanor?" Lucy's throat went dry. She hadn't expected him to push so suddenly, but now that the spotlight was on her, she couldn't escape it. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her mind was racing. She couldn't tell them, not now. The truth was too dangerous. She felt herself standing on the edge of a cliff again, just like last night, but this time there was no turning back. "Don't know what you're talking about," she finally stammered, but even she could hear the weakness in her voice. Her pulse quickened, and the walls seemed to close in around her. Mr. Treves didn't buy it. His eyes flashed with the certainty of someone who had been right all along. "I think you do, Lucy," he said softly, "and I think Eleanor's disappearance is tied to you more than you want to admit." The words hung in the air like a poison, sinking deep into the hearts of those in the room. Cliffhanger ending. Lucy stood frozen, every muscle in her body tense, her mind screaming for an escape. But before she could say another word, the door to the room suddenly slammed open with a force that rattled the walls. Everyone turned toward the sound, their eyes wide with shock. Standing in the doorway was a figure, drenched from head to toe, their clothes clinging to their body like a second skin. It was Eleanor, and she was holding something in her hand. A blood-soaked letter. Midpoint twist. The farmhouse felt colder now, the morning light unable to pierce through the thick fog that had settled over everything. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Everyone's nerves stretched taut like the strings of a violin. They were no longer just waiting for answers, they were desperate for them. But as the minutes ticked by, it seemed the answers were as elusive as the mist swirling outside the farmhouse. Then a knock came at the door. The sudden sound pierced the silence, making everyone jump. Mr. Treves rose slowly from his chair, his face a mask of unreadable calm, as he approached the door. The others exchanged nervous glances, their breath caught in their throats. When Mr. Treves opened it, there she stood. Eleanor Green. She was drenched, her clothes clinging to her trembling form as though she'd been dragged through the storm itself. Her hair hung in wet strands around her pale face, and her eyes were wide with terror. Her body shuddered, like a leaf caught in a storm, but she said nothing, not a word. Mr. Treves stepped back, allowing her inside. The others crowded around, each of them looking at her with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "She's alive," Nicholas whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. The tension in the room only heightened with Eleanor's return. What had happened to her? Where had she been? Why had she vanished in the first place? Eleanor didn't answer. She stood in the middle of the room, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, as if she were fighting to keep herself from breaking down completely. "What happened, Eleanor?" David asked, his voice gentle, almost pleading. He stepped closer, but Eleanor flinched, taking a step back. Her lips parted, but it was as though the words had gotten stuck in her throat. She opened her mouth several more times, but nothing came out. Finally she spoke, but her voice was so low, it was almost a whisper. I was pushed off the cliff," she stammered, her eyes wide with horror. Her gaze flickered to each of them, a silent plea for understanding, but there was something else in her eyes too, something darker, something that made them all uneasy. "But who?" Mr. Treves asked, his voice calm, probing. He studied her closely, his sharp gaze missing nothing. Eleanor looked at him, her expression full of fear, but her lips pressed into a tight line. She shook her head. "I can't," she said, her voice cracking. "I can't say. Not yet." There was an edge to her voice that sent a chill down their spines. It wasn't just fear. It was the unmistakable sound of someone who had seen something they couldn't unsee. Someone who was hiding something or was being forced to. The silence that followed was unbearable, stretching out like an eternity. They all stared at Eleanor, waiting for her to say more, but the words didn't come. Mr. Treves felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Something was off. The whole situation had taken a turn into something far darker than anyone had anticipated. He had been right about one thing. This wasn't just about murder. Whoever was behind this wasn't satisfied with just killing. They wanted something far more sinister. They wanted control. They wanted to play with their victims like pawns on a chessboard. A realization hit him like a hammer to the chest. This wasn't just about eliminating people. This was about manipulation, psychological torture. Whoever was behind this enjoyed toying with their victims' minds, pushing them into corners, creating confusion, and eroding trust. It was as if every person in this room was being pulled into a twisted game where the rules changed with every new twist, every new revelation. "I need to ask again, Eleanor," Mr. Treves said, his tone softer now, though his eyes remained sharp. "Who did this to you? Who pushed you?" Eleanor's eyes darted to the others, her gaze wild, as though she couldn't decide who to trust. Finally she turned away from them all and looked directly at Mr. Treves, her voice barely a whisper. I can't say. Not yet. But you need to find out who's behind this, Mr. Treves, before they do it again." Her words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. Before they do it again. The room went cold. Eleanor's warning echoed through their minds, each of them trying to piece together what it meant. Suddenly, there was a sound of scraping, soft and unsettling, coming from the hallway outside. Everyone froze. The sound grew louder, closer, until the door to the drawing room slowly creaked open. The room went deathly silent. No one moved. And then, standing in the doorway, was a shadowed figure, a figure they hadn't seen before. The figure was tall, cloaked in black, their face obscured by a hood. The figure stood there for a moment, motionless, as the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, without a word, the figure stepped inside. In one hand, the figure held a single object. It was a piece of cloth blood-stained, tightly clenched in their fist, the same fabric as Eleanor's scarf. And in the other hand, they held a letter marked with Eleanor's name, but not addressed to her. It was addressed to someone else in the room. Cliffhanger ending. The letter, the cloth, the figure standing there in the doorway. The group stared, paralyzed by the figure's sudden appearance, the mystery deepening with every passing second. And then, as the figure stepped forward, their voice low, chilling cut through the silence. The game has only just begun. The final act. The farmhouse was silent. The sound of waves crashing against the cliffs seemed distant, almost irrelevant compared to the tension that hung thick in the air. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the room bathed in shadows. The storm outside had picked up once again, a chaotic reflection of the turmoil brewing inside. Nicholas Trent was dead. His body had been found in the boathouse lifeless, sprawled across the floor, his face twisted in an expression of shock. His hands were still clutching a broken glass, a half-finished drink spilling across the floor in a pool of crimson. His death had been swift, his end brutal. A wave of confusion swept through the remaining guests. Had it been an accident, a fight gone wrong? Or was this the hand of the killer once again striking without warning? Mr. Treves had gathered everyone in the grand library, a space lined with towering bookshelves and heavy curtains that muffled the world outside. The room smelled of old leather, ink, and a growing sense of dread. Everyone was tense, fidgeting, exchanging nervous glances, avoiding eye contact. They all knew they were no longer simply participants in a weekend getaway. They were suspects. Every movement, every word, every glance now held meaning. Mr. Treves stood at the head of the room, his posture upright, his voice steady but sharp. "Someone in this room is responsible for the deaths," he began, his gaze sweeping across each of the guests. "And I intend to reveal who." The room grew colder. Eleanor, still visibly shaken from her earlier ordeal, clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. David's eyes were darting nervously, as if he was trying to read everyone in the room. Lucy stood at the far end, arms crossed, her face unreadable. And then there was Imran watching, waiting, his lips pressed together in a thin line. Mr. Treves spoke again, this time more pointedly. "Eleanor Green," he said, his voice cutting through the thick air. "You were being blackmailed by Nicholas Trent. The secret he held over you was dark indeed." A shocked gasp filled the room. Eleanor's face went pale, and she stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Tell us, Eleanor," Mr. Treves continued, his tone gentle but insistent. "What was it that Nicholas knew? What secret was he blackmailing you over?" Eleanor's eyes flickered to the others in the room. There was a split second of hesitation and internal battle raging in her mind. Finally, her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "He knew about my son," she said, her face turning an even darker shade of pale. "My son, who died when he was just a child. No one knew the truth. I told everyone it was an accident, but it wasn't. It was my fault." A gasp rippled through the group. They had all heard whispers of a tragedy that had been swept under the rug, but no one had known the full story. Eleanor's secret was like a festering wound that had been concealed for years, but now in the light of truth it was open, raw, and exposed. "And Nicholas, he threatened to reveal everything," Eleanor continued, her voice shaking. "He said he would destroy everything I'd worked for, unless I gave him what he wanted." "Which was?" Mr. Treves asked, pressing forward. "Money," Eleanor said softly, her eyes brimming with tears. "He wanted money, enough to make him disappear, to make sure he had control over me. But I couldn't give him what he wanted. Not after everything that had happened." David shifted uneasily. His hand trembled, though he was trying to conceal it. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could speak, Mr. Treves cut him off. "Which brings us to you, David Hale," he said, his gaze piercing. "You were accused of being financially desperate. You had a motive eager to escape your own debts. You were in the boathouse when Nicholas was found dead, weren't you?" David's eyes widened in surprise. He stammered, trying to find his words, but before he could say anything, Mr. Treves raised a hand to silence him. "You were quick to defend yourself, but your alibi has holes," Mr. Treves continued. "There was a struggle in the boathouse, evidence of someone trying to resist. And you, David, were seen leaving the boathouse just moments before Nicholas's body was discovered." The room fell silent, the tension reaching a fever pitch. David looked cornered now, his face flushing with panic. He had no defense, no words that could convince anyone of his innocence. "I didn't do it," David said, his voice shaking with fear and frustration. "I didn't kill him, I swear." Mr. Treves raised his hand again, a sharp motion that quieted the room. He turned his attention to Lucy Parker, who had been standing quietly in the back, her arms crossed, eyes scanning the group. "I'm sorry, Lucy," Mr. Treves said, his voice grave. "But you're the one I've been watching all along. You're the killer." Lucy's eyes snapped to him, her expression shifting from calm to one of complete shock. Her breath caught in her throat. "What?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You were too calm throughout this," Mr. Treves continued, stepping closer to her. "You knew more than you let on. You had access to the letters, the threats, everything. You knew exactly how to manipulate everyone in this room. You even had an affair with Nicholas threatened you too, didn't he? But unlike Eleanor, you saw an opportunity to get rid of him. You saw the chance to kill him, to take control of your own life." A stunned silence filled the room. The accusation hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating everyone. Lucy was frozen, her face pale as she stared at Mr. Treves. There was no denying it anymore. The truth was out. But then, just as Mr. Treves finished speaking, a loud crash echoed from outside the room. The door burst open. The figure in black, the same mysterious person who had appeared earlier, stood in the doorway, holding something in their hand, a gun, and in the other hand, another letter addressed to Mr. Treves himself. "You're not done yet," the figure said, their voice low and menacing. Cliffhanger ending. The room was thrown into chaos. Lucy's fate was sealed, but now they had a new threat to face. The figure in black, with the gun in hand, had just turned everything upside down again. What did the letter say? Who was this mysterious figure? And most importantly, who was really pulling the strings? The room plunged into darkness as the final moments of this twisted game unfolded. The chilling truth was just beginning to reveal itself, and no one was safe. The shocking climax. The library was eerily silent, the tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. Everyone's eyes were fixed on Lucy Parker, her arms still crossed, but her face a mask of cold resolve. The weight of the accusations hung heavily around her, each word from Mr. Treves piercing deeper into the already taut atmosphere. Lucy had not said a word since Mr. Treves pointed the finger at her, but her stillness spoke volumes. Her eyes darted to each of the guests, a flicker of uncertainty passing over her face before she took a slow, deliberate step forward. The room held its collective breath, as if waiting for her to either collapse in denial or embrace the truth. "I didn't kill Nicholas," she said finally, her voice low and controlled, but there was something in her tone, something chilling that sent shivers down everyone's spine. "But yes, I wanted him gone. I wanted him out of my life, but I didn't kill him, not directly." The others exchanged uneasy glances. What did she mean? How could she not have killed him but still wanted him gone? Lucy stepped into the center of the room, the shadows in the corners of the library growing longer as the storm outside raged on. Her gaze hardened as she turned to face them, her expression no longer that of the composed, charming woman they had once known. There was something darker, a glint of madness that flickered in her eyes. "Don't you see?" she asked, her voice rising, gaining strength as she spoke. "It was never about the money. It was never about anything Nicholas had on me. It was always about control. Power." The guests looked at each other in confusion, unable to comprehend the twisted logic unfolding before them. Lucy's lips curled into a slow, unsettling smile, as if she were savoring every word. I was always the one who was overlooked, ignored. The charming little journalist, the woman who would smile and listen, but no one would ever truly see her. Not until I made them. Not until I took control. Her breath was quickening, her chest rising and falling in sharp, rapid motions. It was clear to everyone now Lucy was unraveling. Her descent into madness was happening in real time, each word taking her further from sanity. And when I met Nicholas, she continued, her eyes narrowing. He was the perfect pawn. He thought he could manipulate me, control me like he did with everyone else. But I was smarter than that. I used him. I turned the tables. I watched him, learned his every move, and made him think I was his ally. But no one, not him, not any of you, realized that I had already set my plan into motion. The others stood frozen, unable to move, as Lucy's words weaved their hypnotic, unsettling rhythm around them. She was losing herself to the chaos, to the very darkness that had consumed her mind. She was no longer the person they had thought they knew. She had become someone else entirely. I manipulated Nicholas, she said, her voice laced with venom. I played him. Every word, every glance, every gesture, all of it was calculated. I led him to believe he had control over me. And then, when he was most vulnerable, I made sure the one thing he truly wanted, the one thing that would have destroyed me, disappeared. I didn't need to kill him. All I had to do was pull the right strings, push him into a corner, and let him destroy himself. A cold laugh escaped her lips, sending chills through the group. It was always about control, she repeated. Nothing more. I just wanted to be in charge of my own fate, to not be the victim anymore, and no one was going to stop me. Not Nicholas, not any of you. The guests were paralyzed with shock. Their mouths were agape, struggling to process the confession. They had all been led to believe they were just dealing with a charming, inquisitive journalist, a woman searching for stories. But now, they realized she had been searching for something much darker. Power. A power that would not only control her own life, but theirs as well. Lucy's gaze flickered to each of them, one by one, lingering on each face in turn, as if savoring their confusion, their terror. I didn't want Nicholas dead, she said, her voice softening, almost wistful. I wanted to see him fall. I wanted to watch him struggle, to unravel his own web of lies until he couldn't escape. But someone else. She paused, her smile growing as she leaned in slightly. Someone else took matters into their own hands. Her words hung in the air like a knife, waiting to drop. The room held its breath. Was she admitting to being a part of the bigger scheme? Had she set up Nicholas's murder to make him think he was in control? Or was there another force, even more dangerous, operating in the shadows? The guests stared at her in stunned silence, the storm outside seeming to echo the chaos inside. But Lucy was far from done. You think I'm the mastermind, don't you? She said, almost mockingly. You think I planned everything, every move, every death. But the truth is, I was never the one pulling the strings. The words hit them like a freight train. Their minds raced, trying to connect the dots. If Lucy wasn't the one behind it all, then who was? Someone. Someone else is playing us all, Lucy said, her voice taking on a twisted calmness. Someone who's been watching, waiting, and you'll never know who they are. Not until it's too late. With a final, almost serene smile, Lucy stepped back into the shadows. The others, wide-eyed and breathless, couldn't take their eyes off her. They were trapped in her web, and now, the true puppet master had revealed themselves, but their identity remained a mystery. The room plunged into darkness, save for a flicker of light from the dying storm outside. The storm raged, and the truth once again seemed just out of reach. Cliffhanger ending. Who was this unseen puppet master? What game were they playing with Lucy and with the rest of the guests? The truth felt more elusive than ever, leaving the guests and the audience scrambling to piece together the final puzzle. But Lucy's cryptic words hung in the air, suffocating as they realized that they weren't just dealing with one killer, but a mastermind who had manipulated them all. The storm outside raged louder, drowning out the last echo of Lucy's chilling confession. What happens next? Will they uncover the true killer? Or is it already too late? Epilogue. The village, once alive with the feverish pulse of fear and suspicion, now lay quiet under a somber sky. The storm had passed, leaving only a heavy, lingering silence in its wake. The cliffs, where so much of the drama had unfolded, were now still, as if the land itself had chosen to forget what had transpired over the past days. The guests, long since departed, had scattered back to their lives, the weight of the revelation still heavy on their shoulders. The mansion, once a symbol of elegance, now stood as a tomb, a place where secrets were unearthed, where lives were shattered, and where one question remained unanswered: who truly orchestrated it all? Mr. Treves stood at the edge of the cliffs, his gaze fixed on the horizon, the faint sound of waves crashing against the rocks below providing the only soundtrack to the scene. His hands were clasped behind his back, his usual calm composure betraying none of the internal turmoil that had been stirring within him since the first moment he had set foot in this place. He hadn't solved the mystery, not completely. The pieces didn't quite fit together, and yet in his mind, he knew something that the others didn't. The puppet master, the true mastermind, was still out there. The game had only just begun. Murder's 0 point starts long before the crime itself, he muttered to himself, the words slipping from his lips like an ancient truth. He had said it to the others, but now, standing alone with his thoughts, the meaning of those words settled deeper into his soul. Murder, he knew, was not an isolated event. It didn't simply begin when the first body fell. It was a slow-burning fuse, one that had been lit long before the crime itself. The whispers, the hidden motives, the careful manipulations, that was where the real story had started. And no one in the group, no matter how deep their search had gone, had understood the full scope of the forces at play. He could feel the pull of something, a mystery just out of reach, a sense that this puzzle was part of a much larger game, a game that didn't end when the last of the guilty were revealed, a game that had been set in motion long before he had even arrived at the mansion. His fingers grazed the cold stone at his side, his thoughts darkening. He had been close, so close to uncovering everything. Yet he knew now that this was no ordinary case. This was just the beginning, a single chapter in a story that stretched far beyond this quiet village, far beyond any of them. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the distant landscape, as if looking for an answer in the rolling hills and dense forests. But there was nothing there, just the silence of a village that had forgotten what it once knew. Is it really over? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. With a deep breath, Mr. Treves straightened, his mind sharp despite the exhaustion settling in his bones. The world was full of hidden mysteries, and while this one had been unraveled in part, he knew the darkness had only begun to show its face. The real game was yet to unfold. A figure approached from behind a local constable, his face tired, his steps slow. He held a letter in his hand, one with a dark, heavy seal that had not been there before. Mr. Treves didn't need to ask who it was from. He could feel it in his gut, the tension in the air, the quiet intensity that wrapped around him like a second skin. Another case? The constable asked, voice low and hesitant. Mr. Treves took the letter without a word, his eyes scanning the seal. His lips curled into a subtle, knowing smile as he broke it open. He skimmed the contents quickly, no surprise, no shock. This was a summons, a calling, a new riddle to solve. Seems so, Mr. Treves said softly, folding the letter and slipping it into his coat pocket. Another mystery, another truth, waiting to be uncovered. He turned and began walking away from the cliff's edge, his steps slow and deliberate. The wind picked up, brushing through his hair, as the first signs of dawn began to break across the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. The world, he realized, was filled with endless puzzles, and he was just one man in search of the pieces. But as his figure grew smaller in the distance, there was a lingering question in the air, a question that would stay with the listeners long after the scene ended. What if the mysteries never end? Cliffhanger ending. As Mr. Treves walks away, the sound of his footsteps fades, and the listeners are left in the gripping uncertainty of what's to come. A new case, a new mystery, and, in the back of their minds, a haunting realization. The truth may never be fully revealed. Is this the end? Or is the next chapter already unfolding somewhere, waiting for the right person to discover it? The listeners are left with this final unanswered question hanging in the air. Would the mystery ever be solved? Or would the darkness continue to grow, hiding truths that no one could uncover? What happens next?